Computational cognitive science. We start by distinguishing between computational modelling and artificial intelligence. Computational modelling involves programming computers to model or mimic aspects of human cognitive functioning. In contrast, artificial intelligence involves constructing computer systems that produce intelligent outcomes but may do so in ways bearing little resemblance to those used by humans. Consider Deep Blue, the chess program that defeated the world champion Garry Kasparov on 11th of May 1997. Deep Blue considered up to 200 million positions per second, which is vastly more than any human chess players. Computational cognitive scientists develop computational models to understand human cognition. A good computational model shows us how a given theory can be specified and allows us to predict behaviour in new situations. Early mathematical models made predictions but often lacked an explanatory component. For example, having 3 traffic violations predicts well whether someone is a bad risk for car insurance, but it's not clear why. A major benefit of the computational models developed in the computational cognitive science is that they often provide an explanatory and predictive basis for a phenomenon. In the past, and even nowadays, many experimental cognitive psychologists expressed whether their theories in vague verbal statements, which made it hard to decide whether the evidence fitted the theory. As Murphy pointed out, verbal theories provide theorists with undesirable wiggle room. In contrast, a computational model requires the researcher to be explicit about a theory in a way that a verbal theory does not. Implementing a theory as a program is a good way to check it contains no hidden assumptions or imprecise terms. This often reveals that the theory makes predictions the theorist concerned has not realised. There are issues concerning the relationship between the performance of a computer program and human performance. It is rarely meaningful to relate a program's speed doing a simulated task to the reaction times of human participants, because its processing times are affected by psychologically irrelevant features. For example, programs run faster on more powerful computers. However, the various materials presented to the program should result in differences in program operation time, correlating closely with differences in participants' reaction times when processing the same materials. The 2 key terms mentioned before were computational modelling. This involves constructing computer programs that simulate or mimic human cognitive processes, and artificial intelligence. This involves developing computer programs that produce intelligent outcomes. Types of models. Most computational models focus on relatively specific aspects of human cognition. For example, some of the most successful computational models provide accounts of reading words and non-words aloud. However, some computational models are more ambitious. This is especially the case with cognitive architectures, which are cognitive models that are domain generic, which means cover many domains or areas, and encompass a wide range of cognitive applicabilities. Byrne evaluated some of the major cognitive architectures, including J.R. Anderson and others' Adaptive Control of Thought Rationale, ACT-R, which is discussed later. There are more computational models than you can shake a stick at. However, numerous otherwise diverse models can be categorised as connectionist models, and so we will focus on them. Connectionism. Connectionist models typically consist of interconnected networks of simple units exhibiting learning. Within such networks, each item of knowledge is represented by a pattern of activation spread over numerous units rather than by a single location. Connectionist networks often, but not always, have the following characteristics. The network consists of elementary or neuron-like units or nodes connected together, with a single unit having many links to other units. Units influence other units by exciting or inhibiting them. The unit usually takes the weighted sum of all the input links and produces a single output to another unit if the weighted sum exceeds some threshold value. The network as a whole is characterised by the properties of the units that make it up, by the way they are connected together, and by the rules used to change the strength of connections among units. Networks can have different structures or layers. They can have a layer of input links, immediate layers, in brackets hidden units, and a layer of output units. A representation of a concept can be stored in a distributed way by an activation pattern throughout the network. The same network can store several patterns without disruption if they are sufficiently distinct. And an important learning rule used in networks is called backward propagation of errors. Connectionist networks model cognitive performance without using any explicit rules. They do this by storing patterns of activation within the network in which various inputs are associated with various outputs. Connectionist models typically consist of several layers. One layer consists of input units that encode a stimulus as a pattern of activation. Another layer is an outer layer producing some response as a pattern of activation. When the network has learned to produce a given response at the output layer following the presentation of a given stimulus at the input layer, it exhibits behaviour that looks rule-based. The key terms previously were cognitive architecture, a comprehensive framework for understanding human cognition in the form of a computer program, and connectionist models. Models in computational cognitive science consisting of interconnected networks of simple units. The networks exhibit learning through experience and specific terms of knowledge are distributed across the numerous units. Backward propagation of errors, or backprop, is an extremely important learning rule. Backpropagation is a mechanism following a network to learn to associate a given input pattern with a given output pattern by comparing actual responses against correct ones. The network is initially set up with random weights on the links among the units. During the early stages of learning, the output units often produce an incorrect pattern or response following presentation of the input pattern. Backprop compares the imperfect pattern with the known required response, noting the errors. It then backpropagates activation through the network so the weights between the units are adjusted to produce the required pattern. This process is repeated until the network produces the required pattern. Thus, the model learns the appropriate behaviour without being explicitly programmed to do so. Sadly, research in cognitive neuroscience has found little or no evidence of backpropagation in the human brain. Several connectionist models, example the parallel distributed processing approach of Rumelhart and others, assume representations are stored in a distributed fashion across the brain. There are potential problems with this assumption. Suppose we encode two words at the same time. That would cause numerous units or nodes to become activated, making it hard or even impossible to decide which units or nodes belong to which word. There is also evidence that much information is stored in a given brain location rather than in a distributed fashion. For example, as mentioned earlier, Quiroga and others discovered a neuron in the medial temporal lobe that responded strongly when pictures of the actress Jennifer Aniston were presented, but not other famous people. Some connectionist models assume there is a local representation of knowledge. Localist connectionist models include the reading model of Kohlhart and others, the trace model, TRACE, of word recognition, and the models of speech production put forward by Dell and by Levelt and others. It is likely some knowledge is represented locally and some is distributed. The key term for that section was backpropagation, which is a learning mechanism in connectionist models based on comparing actual responses to correct ones. Production systems. Production systems consist of numerous if-then production rules. Production rules can take many forms. However, an everyday example is if the green man is lit up, then cross the road. There is also a working memory, i.e. system holding information currently being processed. If information from the environment that the green man is lit up reaches working memory, it will match the if part of the rule in long-term memory and trigger the then part of the rule, i.e. cross the road. Production systems come in various shapes and sizes but generally have the following characteristics. Numerous if-then rules, a working memory containing information, a production system that operates by matching the contents of working memory against the if parts of the rules and executing the then parts. If information in working memory matches the if parts of two rules, a conflict resolution strategy selects one. Many aspects of cognition can be specified as sets of if-then rules. For example, chess knowledge can readily be represented as a set of productions based on rules such as if the queen is threatened, then move the queen to a safe square. In this way, people's basic knowledge can be regarded as a collection of productions. Newell and Simon first established the usefulness of production system models in their general problem solver, which identified cognitive processes involved in problem solving. However, these models have a wider applicability. For example, there is J.R. Anderson's ACT-R. This is a cognitive architecture and is discussed next. But before I do, I'll just go over that key term, which is production systems. Production systems consist of very large numbers of if-then production rules, which is also a key term, and a working memory containing information. And the production rules key term, if-then or condition action rules in which the action is carried out whenever the appropriate condition is present. And the last key term is working memory, a system holding information currently being processed. So Anderson's ACT-R model. John Anderson has produced several versions of Adaptive Control of Thought Rationale, ACT-R. The version described by Anderson and others is based on the assumption that the cognitive system consists of several modules, relatively independent subsystems. ACT-R combines computational cognitive science with cognitive neuroscience by identifying the brain regions associated with each module. 4 modules are of particular importance to human cognition. And those 4 modules are the retrieval module. It maintains the retrieval cues needed to access information. Its proposed location is the inferior ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Number 2 is the imaginal module. It transforms problem representations to assist in problem solving. It is located in the posterior parietal cortex. And the goal module keeps track of an individual's intentions and controls information processing. It's located in the anterior cingulate cortex. And the procedural module. It uses production, if-then rules to determine what action will be taken next. It is located at the head of the caudate nucleus within the basal ganglia. Each module has a buffer associated with it containing a limited amount of important information. How is information from these buffers integrated? According to Anderson, a central production system can detect patterns in these buffers and take coordinated action. If several productions could be triggered by the information contained in the buffers, one is selected based on the value or gain associated with each outcome, plus the amount of time or cost incurred in achieving that outcome. ACT-R represents an impressive attempt to provide a theoretical framework for understanding information processing and performance on numerous cognitive tasks. It is an ambitious attempt to integrate computational cognitive science with cognitive neuroscience. What are the limitations of ACT-R? First, it's very hard to provide adequate tests of such a wide-ranging theory. Second, it can be argued that areas of prefrontal cortex, example dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, generally assumed to be of major importance in cognition are de-emphasised. Third, as discussed earlier, research within cognitive neuroscience increasingly reveals the importance to cognitive processing of brain networks rather than specific regions. Links with other approaches. The great majority of computational models until fairly recently were designed to predict and understand behavioural data from experiments in cognitive psychology. Recently, however, there has been a substantial increase in computational models of direct relevance to cognitive neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience, example ACT-R. How are computational models applied to cognitive neuropsychological data from brain-damaged patients? Typically, the starting point is to develop a computational model that accounts for the performance of healthy individuals on some task. After that, aspects of the computational model or program are altered to simulate lesions, and the effects on task performance are assessed. Finally, the lesioned model's performance can be compared against that of brain-damaged patients. Overall evaluation. Computational cognitive science has several strengths. First, the development of cognitive architectures offers the prospect of providing an overarching framework within which to understand the cognitive system. Such a framework could be very valuable. This is especially so given that much empirical research in cognitive psychology is limited in scope and suffers from paradigm specificity. However, there is controversy concerning the extent to which this goal has been achieved. Second, the scope of computational cognitive science has increased over time. Initially, it was applied mainly to behavioural data. More recently, computational modelling has been applied to functional neuroimaging data. In addition, many computational cognitive scientists lesion their models to see the effects of damage to various parts of the model and to compare their findings against behavioural data from brain-damaged patients. Third, the development of computational models requires theorists to think carefully and rigorously. This is the case because computer programs must contain detailed information about the processes involved in performing any given task. In contrast, many theories in verbal form are vaguely expressed, and it is unclear precisely what predictions follow from their assumptions. Fourth, it is often possible to make progress by using what is known as nested incremental modelling. In essence, a new model builds upon the strengths of previous related models while eliminating their weaknesses and accounting for additional data. For example, Perry and others put forward a connectionist dual process model, CDP+, of reading aloud that improved on the dual process model from which it was derived. What are the main limitations of the computational cognitive science approach? First, there is Bernini's paradox. As a model of a complex system becomes more complete, it becomes less understandable. Alternatively, as a model grows more realistic, it also becomes just as difficult to understand as the real-world processes it represents. The relation between a map and a territory provides a simple example of Bernini's paradox. A map the same size as the territory it represents would be maximally precise but also completely unusable. In practice, however, the increased complexity of computational models has been accompanied by a substantial increase in their power. Second, it is sometimes difficult to falsify computational models, although typically easier than with theories expressed only in verbal terms. Why is this? The ingenuity of computational modelers means that many models can account for numerous behavioural findings. Of promise for the future is the prospect of computational models being applied more systematically to neuroimaging findings as well as behavioural ones. Third, there are various ways in which computational modelers increase the apparent success of their model. One example is overfitting. This happens when a model accounts extremely well for a given data set but fails to generalise to other data sets. This can occur when a model accounts for noise in the data as well as genuine effects. Fourth, human cognition is influenced by several potentially conflicting motivational and emotional factors. Most computational models ignore these factors, although ACTR has a motivational component in its goal module. We can distinguish between a cognitive system, the pure cognitive system, and a biological system, the regulatory system. Much activity of the pure cognitive system is determined by the regulatory system's needs, example survival, food and water. Computational cognitive science, like most of cognitive psychology, typically de-emphasises the regulatory system's key role. Fifth, it is difficult to assess most computational models in detail. And there are several reasons for this. Everyone still programs in his or own favourite programming language. Source code is rarely made available. Accessibility of models to non-programming researchers is essentially non-existent, and even for other modelers, the profusion of source code in a multitude of programming languages, writing without programming guidelines makes it almost impossible to access, check, explore, reuse, or continue to develop. The key term for the next section is converging operations, an approach in which several methods with different strengths and limitations are used to address a given issue. Comparisons of major approaches. We have discussed the major approaches to human cognition at length, and you may be wondering which one is the most useful and informative. In fact, that is not the best way of thinking about these issues for various reasons. First, an increasing amount of research involves two or more of the approaches. Second, each approach makes its own distinctive contribution, and so all are needed. In terms of an analogy, it is pointless asking whether a driver is more or less useful than a putter to a golfer. Both are essential. Third, as well as its own strengths, each approach also has its own limitations. What is optimal in such circumstances is to use converging operations. Several different research methods are used to address a given theoretical issue with the strength of one method balancing out the limitations of the other methods. If two or more methods produce the same answer, that provides stronger evidence than could be obtained using a single method. If different methods produce different answers, then further research is needed to clarify the situation. The major goal of research is to enhance our understanding of human cognition. In writing this book, our central aim with each topic discussed has been to focus on research that best achieves that goal. Outline of this book. One problem with writing a textbook of cognitive psychology is that virtually all the processes and systems in the cognitive system are interdependent. Consider, for example, a student reading a book to prepare for an examination. The student is learning, but several other processes are going on as well. Visual perception is involved in the intake of information from the printed page, and there is attention to the content of the book. In order for the student to benefit from the book, he or she must possess considerable language skills and must have extensive relevant knowledge stored in long-term memory. There may be an element of problem solving in the student's attempts to relate the book's content to the possibly conflicting information he or she has learned elsewhere. Decision making may also be involved when the student decides how much time to devote to each chapter. In addition, what the student learns depends on his or her emotional state. Finally, the acid test of whether the student's learning has been effective comes during the examination itself, when the material from the book must be retrieved and consciously evaluated to decide its relevance to the examination question. The words italicised in the previous paragraphs indicate major ingredients of human cognition and form the basis of our coverage. And so they were reading, learning, visual perception, attention, language skills, long-term memory, problem solving, decision making, emotional state, retrieved and consciously. In view of the interdependence of all aspects of the cognitive system, there is an emphasis in this book on how each process, example perception, depends on other processes and structures, example attention, long-term memory. This should aid the task of understanding the complexities of human cognition. And finally, we have a chapter summary. The introduction. Cognitive psychology used to be unified by an approach based on an analogy between the mind and the computer. This information processing approach viewed the mind as a general-purpose, simple processing system of limited capacity. Today, there are four main approaches to human cognition: experimental cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, cognitive neuropsychology, and computational cognitive science. However, the four approaches are increasingly combined with information from behaviour and brain actively being integrated. Cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychologists assume that top-down and bottom-up processes are both involved in the performance of cognitive tasks. These processes can be serial or parallel. Various methods, example latent variable analysis, have been used to address the task impurity problem and to identify the processes within cognitive tasks. In spite of the enormous contribution made by cognitive psychology, it sometimes lacks ecological validity, suffers from paradigm specificity, and possesses theoretical vagueness. Cognitive neuropsychology. Cognitive neuropsychology is based on various assumptions including modularity, anatomical modularity, uniformity of functional architecture, and subtractivity. Double dissociations provide reasonable, but not definitive, evidence for separate modules or systems. The case study approach is generally, but not always, more informative than the single case approach. Cognitive neuropsychology is limited because patients can develop compensatory strategies, because it de-emphasises findings in cognitive neuroscience, because it underestimates integrated brain functioning, and because the brain damage is often so extensive that it is hard to interpret the findings. Cognitive neuroscience, the brain in action. Cognitive neuroscientists study the brain as well as behaviour using techniques varying in spatial and temporal resolution. Functional neuroimaging techniques provide basically correlation evidence, but TMS can indicate that a given brain area is necessarily involved in a particular cognitive function. The richness of the data obtained from neuroimaging studies is so great that functional specialisation and brain integration can both be assessed. Cognitive neuroscience is a flexible and potentially self-correcting approach. However, findings are sometimes over-interpreted. More research is needed into possible problems with ecological validity and fMRI studies. Computational cognitive science. Computational cognitive scientists develop computational models to understand human cognition. Connectionist networks make use of elementary units or nodes connected together. They can learn using rules such as backpropagation. Production systems consist of productions or if-then rules. ACTR is one of the most developed theories based on production systems. Computational models have increased in scope to provide detailed theoretical accounts of findings from cognitive neuroscience and cognitive neuropsychology. They have shown progress via the use of nested incremental modelling. Computational models are often hard to falsify and they generally de-emphasise motivational and emotional factors. Comparisons of different approaches. The major approaches are increasingly used in combination. Each approach has its own strengths and limitations, which makes it useful to use converging operations. When two approaches produce the same findings, this is stronger evidence than can be obtained from a single approach on its own. If two approaches produce different findings, this indicates additional research is needed to understand what is happening. And that completes week 1, Introduction and History.